We're going to go ahead and get started. There may be some people still in line and parking, but we've got to get the program going. Welcome to the second annual Sharing of Best Practices Conference. My name is Terry May, and I'm the chairman of the Oklahoma Quality Foundation and also CEO of Mesa and Tulsa. For those of you who are not familiar with the Oklahoma Quality Foundation, I would like to share a few things with you. Our Quality Awards program, patterned after the Malcolm Baldrige National Quality Award, is our platform outreach program. And we've been in business now for over 20 years. In fact, this is our 20-year anniversary. But we're not just an awards program. We've developed several other outreach programs that include this Sharing of Best Practices Conference and our Executive Learning Series. And we've hosted those in both Oklahoma City and Tulsa. We expect to continue to do that. Our mission is to help Oklahoma organizations improve results and become more competitive through performance excellence. And we appreciate so much you joining us as we present this conference. We've got some great things going on. Before I talk about the conference, I'd like to thank our sponsors. Our presenting sponsors today are the Oklahoma Business Roundtable and the Oklahoma Department of Commerce. Our chairman sponsor is Boeing. Our executive ring sponsors, Integris, Metro Technology Center, the Journal Record, MTM Recognition, the Oklahoma City Department of Career Tech, and the Greater Oklahoma City Chamber. And finally, our associate sponsors, I2E and the Bama companies. I'm going to recap the events today. We've got a plenary session planned this morning featuring the topic of transformational leadership, and I know you're going to enjoy that. At 11:30, we're going to have lunch in this room, followed by a keynote address by Dr. Terry Holliday, closing with the presentation of the 2013 Oklahoma Quality Awards. And then following lunch, there are two tracks covering a number of topics, from employee engagement to customer relationships to social media, and they're all great topics. You're just going to have to decide which one fits you the best and select that track. We're going to be providing plenty of time for networking during the breaks throughout the day. So thanks for attending. We've got a great lineup of topics and speakers, and we know you're going to leave here today with lots of new ideas and energy heading into 2014. You know, I'm standing here right now. I'm 62 years old, but I feel really cool standing up here to tell you today that we're going to be live tweeting. So you can follow us at OKQualityOne, hashtag Best Practices OK on Twitter. The sad thing is I don't even know what that means. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce David Woods and Brent Douglas with GiANT Partners. They're based in Edmond, Oklahoma. David brings over 30 years of experience of building high-growth companies and was the former CEO of Ditch Witch, the world's largest manufacturer of underground construction equipment. Brent served as COO for two technology companies and as vice president of operations for a global construction products company prior to joining GiANT. Brent and David focus not on just developing the right strategy for their clients, but also into converting that strategy into the activities that lead to growth. Our opening topic this morning is about transformational leadership. Doug and Brent and David are going to discuss how to develop a new culture of leadership that's focused on empowering versus overpowering, and that's driven by humility instead of pride. Now's the time to grow our leadership potential and make great changes in leadership culture. One final note on the CEO panel following this, one of our panelists was incorrectly listed in the program, and Dick Greenlee of Water 4 is going to be joining our panel today. So now would you please join me in welcoming David Woods and Brent Douglas to the stage.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that introduction. I'm David, and that's Brent. So he mentioned that I was with Ditch Witch and part of that organization for actually 22 years. It's a it was a dream come true for my mom probably, because she always dreamed that, and what she'd tell me was, if you don't study hard in school, you're going to be a ditch digger. And sure enough, I was just that for about 22 years. But it was a great ride. I've been gone from there for about 10 years now, and we've been fortunate enough to kind of have that second career that's been quite a bit of fun as well. You heard the name GiANT. I've got to tell you just a little bit about GiANT, because part of talking to anybody about something as deep as transformational leadership, you kind of need to know the foundation of where that message is coming from. So let me just talk about our organization. We've been around about 10 years. We build leaders worth following and companies that everyone wants to work for. So that's sort of our mission, what we try to do. We have about 500,000 customers worldwide. We have offices here. It all started here in Oklahoma City, but now we have offices in Atlanta, which is actually our largest office now, and about 6 months ago opened up a new office in London. These are some of our largest clients that we work with globally, and I thought I'd give you a little bit of a flavor for local. This is we worked with, that was just a sampling of folks that we worked with here locally over the last 10 years. May 9th, some of you, how many of you have ever heard of an event called LeaderCast? Anybody ever heard or been to one of those? Okay. Well, it's actually now the world's largest single-day leadership event. This year we'll have probably close to 150,000 people attend that event. It's done live in Atlanta. And then we'll have about 5,000 people in Atlanta, and it's broadcast out to about 700 or so host sites. We'll actually have host sites here. I know there's about 6 locations across the state that have that. Because we have an office here, we'll probably be down at the Boathouse doing sort of an event there, and we'll have room for about 150 executives down there to attend that. But this year we've got, those are the speakers from last year. This year we'll have Jack Welch again. Desmond Tutu will be speaking actually remotely from Africa, and his daughter lives in Atlanta, so we're going to have a little duo there. It'll be a lot of fun, and a variety of others. So it'll be a great day on May 9th. So let's have some fun. Let's talk about some things. The first thing I want to talk about is we're going to let you use some technology. So most people say turn these off. What I would say is turn those on. And you can go to joinspeaker.com/GiANT, and we've got some technology here where you can text a question at any point up to us. And the beauty of that is, you've all sat in conferences before where it's sort of the same people that always ask the questions. Well, the beauty of having it text is everybody gets a chance to ask a question. The only difference is Brent and I get to filter them and pick the ones we want to answer, but please ask anything that you want. We really do like getting questions on the fly. Brent will be watching for the questions to come in while I'm talking, and I'll look for the questions when he's talking. So again, that'll be popping up on any kind of questions or feedback. Okay, so let's talk about the first part about transformational leadership is just simply understanding your job as a leader. So how many of you in here have at least an employee of some kind? Okay, about half of you. Now, how many, and so everybody here works in an organization of some kind, would be my guess. So anytime, and you probably do this, you walk into any organization and you can sort of spot, and after just not very much time at all, a few days inside of an organization, you begin to get a feel for the leadership skills inside that organization. When I say leadership skills, I'm not talking about just the owner or the CEO or whatever that might be. I'm talking about the leadership skills up and down the organization. So it could be first-time leaders, mid-level leaders, top leaders. What you have to understand, it's actually those leadership skills throughout any organization that create the growth or the success of that organization. And for a long time, when organizations start, It's those leadership skills that are pulling the organization up. Now, when your skill sets are sort of above the line, above where you are from a growth or success standpoint, think of those blue arrows as a low stress zone. All right? Now, if you don't continue to work on leadership skills, it's actually those very same skills that can begin to have kind of a pulling down effect, meaning it just gets harder and harder to grow or harder and harder to be as successful as you want. In a lot of organizations, what that sounds like, you'll hear people say things like, I think the organization has outgrown old Joe. Okay, well, what they're simply saying is old Joe is down below and the organization has long since surpassed him. And so you'll see people creating a lot of angst around that because they realize somehow intuitively that that's pulling them down. Now, the goal is, and by the way, those red arrows indicate a high stress zone. What that means is almost everything begins to look like a crisis. Everything looks hard. Everything looks difficult, right? Versus when you're in this world, everything looks a little bit more like low-hanging fruit. It's just easier. I know what to do. Here's the decision we're going to make, those kind of things. So the goal around leadership, so your role as a leader is to make sure you and those around you are getting your skills up above the line. Not even on the line, but above the line. And the reason you want them above the line, again, is so that everything looks like low-hanging fruit. So I can walk into organizations that have really, really top-notch leaders, and they just have a calming effect. Even in the worst of crisis, they're the ones going, hang on, been here before, here's how we're going to get out of this, here's how we're going to leverage all our gifts, we're going to get out of this, we'll be fine, right? Versus the opposite, where you have everything, it's high stress, high pressure. Brent's going to talk a little bit about the effect of stress on an organization as well. So with that, I'm going to let Brent kind of talk. That's kind of one of the first lessons.
All right, thanks, David. First of all, let me just say I've been looking forward to this for about a month or two. David and I did this event last year and had such a great time and are so honored that you guys invited us back. So I'm really grateful that we're here in front of you. But I'm also looking forward to this event today because my wife is in the audience. So I wanted to give her a shout out, Commissioner Patrice Douglas, right over here. Now the reason I'm excited about that is we've been married 25 years. So this is one of the few times that I get to talk and she has to listen, okay? I'm pretty much guaranteed the last word. So if you hear me dive into, here's how you work the remote control or something like that, you'll know what's going on. So this concept of leadership and being above the line, my guess is that most of you, as you look at that graph, you can kind of look at that and say, yeah, I think I'm above the line or below the line. But I remember when we first started talking about this, I always had the question, well, how do you tell? How do I know if I'm a leader that's above that line or below that line? And one of the things, I want to introduce a framework that we use a lot. One of the things you need to understand before you can really answer that question is that every leader, as you move through an organization, you leave a wake in that organization. Now, any boaters in the audience? You want to have boats? Okay. You know that if you're a boater, right, you can look at your wake that you're leaving behind you in the water, and if that wake is sort of ziggly like that, what does that tell you about your steering capability? Not very good, right? You can tell things about how you're doing as a captain based on looking at your wake. Leadership is no different, right? As you go through the organization, you can look at the wake you leave in the organization and get some idea as a leader, am I above that line or below that line? Now, a leader's wake consists primarily of two parts. The first part is, as a leader, what results are you achieving in the organization? If you're heading up a sales effort, are you generating new sales? Is revenue coming in the door? If you're an engineering leader, are you designing new products that are good? Those results are the fairly easy things to measure, right? The other portion of that wake is the people. And that's all around, how do people feel after they interact with you? After you've led a meeting, after you've been, led them for a while, do they feel sort of energized and charged up and feeling good about themselves? Or do they come away from that interaction thinking, I don't ever want to go through that again? And this is a critical point to understand because, again, this is where your journey to sort of getting your leadership above the line starts. So if we take that concept of people and results, one common mistake that a lot of leaders make is they put an or between those two, okay? And I would challenge you, it's not, I can get great results, but only if I abuse my people, or if I'm nice to my people, I can't get results. That's not an or, that's not a zero-sum game, right? You can have great people interaction and a great people wake and get great results. But we can look at, we use this, we call it the challenge support or people versus results matrix. And this, you can kind of probably get some clues as to the type of leader you are. So if you have what we would call sort of low on the results scale and low on the people scale, we would classify your leadership style as one of an abdicator. A person that really doesn't care about results and doesn't care about people, that's sort of that person that just doesn't care. My goal is I want to come into work and I want to just put in my 8 hours and I don't want anybody to give me anything, and that way I'm not responsible, and I don't really care what you do if you're working for me. I'm just going to abdicate that, and that really leads to this culture of very low expectations and a high degree of apathy, okay? You can also have high people skills. People can love working for you, but if you don't challenge around results, then you can create this culture that we call you as a leader as more of a protector leader. I don't want my people to have anything, anything bad happen to them, or I really don't want to push them, because that may be an uncomfortable conversation to hold them accountable on why aren't sales increasing or that kind of stuff. And what we would call that leader is a protector. That leads to this culture of entitlement. Yeah, we're going to love on you, but we're really not going to hold you accountable for anything. And that's not really good. Organizations don't grow with that kind of leadership. Down in the bottom right, and we see this a lot, it's what we call the dominating leader. This is that leader that is all about results, and I don't care the cost to people. I've worked with people like these, and again, these are those guys that you walk away from those interactions that you just, after a while, you just get burned out. It's all about the results, and we call that, kind of creates that culture of manipulation and fear. He didn't care anything about me, it's all about just getting the results. And so what we would say, to get your leadership above the line, try and get yourself over into that high people, high results. And that is possible. Again, that's an and, it's not an or. And we would call that the liberating leader. That's where you have a culture of empowerment, okay, where as a leader, you're holding people accountable, but you're doing it in such a way, with love in your heart and serving them, that you're helping them grow at the same time. These, I guarantee you, are organizations that grow quickly and over the long term. So why is this really important? So the first thing I will say is there is a cost to bad leadership. So a lot of us, having worked with bad leaders before or being around bad leaders before, you would say, well, that's just sort of part of the landscape of business and organizations, right? There are going to be bad leaders, and that's true. But I think it's very important to kind of point out that that's not a freebie, right? There is a cost to dealing with bad leaders. Inc. magazine published a study about a year ago where they tried to document some of this stuff. And I'm going to share with you some of those results. I would caution you, if you're here today with your boss, okay, when I go through these results, it's very important that you keep your eyes focused directly up front on the screen, okay? Don't let your head nod or pointing like this. If you're a boss with your leaders, you probably ought to be looking around, kind of spine body. Like if you see a bunch of people going, oh, that probably doesn't bode well for you. One of the first statistics, 3 out of every 4 employees report that their boss is the worst and most stressful part of their job. I heard someone say, yeah, that's me. 65% of employees say they'd take a new boss over a pay raise. Almost 2/3. 50% of employees who don't feel valued by their boss plan to look for another job in the next year. Bosses, do we like it when people leave? Sometimes maybe yes, but most of the time probably not. It's a pain to go find new people. This last one really blew me away. If you think about all the time and energy and effort organizations put into processes, technology, procedures, and those kinds of things to increase productivity, estimates are bad bosses, just leadership alone, cost the U.S. economy $360 billion each year, all right? Statistics indicate about the average person applies about 50% of their effort at work, meaning they could be accomplishing 80, 90, 100%. They put out at about the 50% point. That's the average. That's the cost of bad bosses. People don't do that because they're empowered at work and they love that. They're that way because leadership is in one of those other quadrants other than liberators. If you don't believe this, I always like to put some comments up from real leaders that we've come across. So I love these. What I need is a list of specific unknown problems we will encounter. This project is so important, we can't let things that are more important interfere with it. Teamwork is people doing what I say. Actually heard a guy say that one time. We know that communication is a problem, but we're just not going to discuss it with the employees. That's a great one. And if I wanted it tomorrow, I would have waited until tomorrow to ask for it, right? Now, I would call that as probably one of those dominating leaders that we talk about, right? Okay, so are we? Maybe it might be a good time for a break because we've got questions coming in. Oh, give me 2 seconds. Let me finish this up, okay? And so the question is, what do we do about that? Are we without hope? And I would say, how many of you have read or are familiar with the book Good to Great? Okay, a lot of people read that. Well, that's about Jim Collins looking at organizations and saying we had some organizations that sort of had some trigger points in their life or whatever that just absolutely took off, right? Our concept is leadership can be the same way. I know when I started out as a leader, there were a lot of things that I didn't know, and I was one of those leaders that wasn't above the line. I was probably below the line. I was fortunate enough that I had great mentors and great people around me that I could learn from and grow as a leader. And so it's not unusual that you have to grow over time to do that. What we want to focus on for the rest of the day, and I'm going to take a couple questions here, what we want to focus on for the rest of the morning, though, is identifying what are those good to great leadership triggers. So David and I spend a lot of time coaching executives and top leaders, and we've just uncovered a lot of stuff that comes up over and over. And these are things that we think are good, those good to great leadership triggers that are sort of those facepalm, kind of moments that, man, I wish I'd known that 2 years ago, that we're going to share with you here in just a minute. And then before I talk about that first one, I guess we've got some questions.
Yep. So two questions popped up. One is, sorry, another one just came up, something about your wife. Let me see here. Was your wife one of those great leaders you learned from? I can answer that. Yes, she is. So.
Yeah, yes. Yeah, she asked that question, by the way. Yeah.
Oh, that's hilarious. That's awesome, Patrice. Way to go. All right, this sounds much like John Maxwell Level 1 and Level 2 leaders. So those of you that may be familiar with the 5 levels of leadership by John Maxwell, absolutely that is. And so when Brent mentioned some of those people in those categories, those were actually some of the different levels. And then the other question, do you believe there is a capacity effect on growth? Simply, do you think people ever reach capacity? And obviously, yes, from the standpoint of there's just too much stuff to do. But a lot of what you do around how you lead, how you build strategy, how you just run things, the goal of a leader is actually to create an organization that increases, like if I'm the leader, my goal is actually to create the organization so the organization learns to grow itself, to provide me more capacity so I can, instead of drive the organization, serve the organization, okay? And what that sounds like is if I'm driving, it's like, hey, where are you on that project? How come it's not done? Let's get this done. Serving the organization sounds like, I love where you guys are going. How can I help? Okay? There's a big difference in those two styles. So everything around growing yourself as a leader is really about increasing the organization's capacity and just as important, if not more important, increasing your own capacity so you can do the right things as a leader.
Absolutely.
Great questions.
The other thing I would echo that on that whole issue of capacity is keep in mind that your job as a leader is to get results. As a leader, you've got to get results, right? But as you grow in your leadership, you've got to focus that on, I've got to get results by influencing and leading other people. So don't think of that capacity as something that I'm responsible for more and more things. As a leader, I've got to do all of that. Your responsibility is to help those around you grow so that overall as an organization, the capacity increases. All right, thanks, David, and thanks for those questions. So the first sort of good to great trigger I want to talk about is this whole concept of understanding the importance of why. Patrice and I have 2 boys. My youngest one, I guarantee you, was going to be an engineer, and I was an engineer for many years. But he loves to ask the question why. So it will always be, Dad, now why is it that I see blue when I look at a blue car? And I tell you, it's challenging when you have to think about how to answer those questions. But I think why is a fantastic question. I read somewhere one time that you can ask, if you can ask or answer up to 4 or 5 levels of why, right? Why, as you sort of dive deeper into something, you're at PhD and above level if you can answer up to 4 levels or why or something like that. A very important question. So oftentimes, as we lead organizations, we get so focused in on sort of the what that we forget about the power of why. Simon Sinek, anybody ever heard of the magic circle? Have you ever watched TED Talks? Simon Sinek about 2 years ago, had a TED Talk that he introduced this concept that he calls the magic circle. And this idea is you take why, how, and what. Most organizations, he said, when you think about how they approach, whether it's marketing or how we do things, they start from the outside of that magic circle and work in. So they start with the question of what are we going to do, and then how are we going to do it, and why is almost a little bit of an afterthought. Remarkable organizations, on the other hand, start with that center of why. Let's answer that question, why. And then once we understand the why and are all on the same page of the why, the how and the whats largely start to take care of themselves. So the example he provides is if you think of Apple Computer, okay, a marketing message around the traditional method, starting from what going to how, would be something like, we're Apple Computer, we sell iPads and computers and iPads. We pay a lot of attention to functional design and doing those in a really cool way, and we're just passionate about computers, okay? Apple, starting from the inside out, might say something like, at Apple, our mission is to change the way people interact with technology. We hire the best engineers and industrial designers in the world to craft the most innovative designs possible, and by the way, we make iPads, computers, and iPods, right? Second message is a whole lot more powerful than the first one, right? Because you're starting with that notion of let's address the why first. Great companies, Tom's Shoes, Zappos, those kinds. You'll hear about one later with Pumps of Oklahoma and Water 4. They have that real concrete connection with why, and it makes them a remarkable organization. The other way to look at that, as leaders, once you get to a top leader of an organization, and start looking at things like income statements and balance sheets, you always hear a lot of talk about the bottom line. And I would challenge you as leaders that there is not one bottom line. Now, I am not saying here that it doesn't matter if you make a profit or generate revenue. Obviously, you've got to do that to be successful. But so many organizations and so many leaders focus only on just the one bottom line. And I would challenge you as a leader, one of the ways to help start moving your leadership above the line and capture that essence of why is start thinking about what are my other bottom lines? Is one of my bottom lines that I really want to have a place that people love working at. I want to create a culture that people feel empowered and as a place that they can grow and all of those other things. Whatever they may be for you, you may have a bottom line that you want to have an organization that impacts the world in some way, and that's great. Whatever that is, don't limit yourself to one bottom line. That is key to getting at that core of why. So how do we go about doing that? I'm going to give you a couple of tips and tools. And before I do that, I first have to tell you a story. So the reason for this story will make sense. So I got two boys that are now 15 and 18. About 4 years ago, I was coming home from work, and it was in the summer, so they were both at home. And I pulled down the street into the driveway, and I noticed there were about 30 kids hanging around the Douglas driveway, okay? And so immediately the dad radar kind of goes up. What's going on? I'm not sure this is a good thing. And what my boys were doing, and they were right in the thick of it, my parents, their grandparents, had given them one of the traditional metal radio flyer red wagon. Anyone have those as a kid growing up? Those are the kind that if you get the front slightly off, you just tip over like that. Well, they had the radio flyer, and we have a driveway that's got on a slight hill, and they would get in the radio flyer at the top of our driveway, and they'd let it go, and the game was across the street. My neighbor, the street ended in a curb, and so the goal was, let's get the radio flyer going fast enough, and which means we have to keep that handle, because if you spill, that's a loss. So keep the radio flyer going fast enough that we impact the curb on the far side of the street with enough force that we are physically launched out of the radio flyer into the bushes, okay? You're now thinking, the Douglas, they kind of play in the shallow end of the gene pool, don't they? No. They had even taken a piece of cardboard and taped over the word radio on the side of the radio flyer and had put the words emergency room. So they had created the emergency room flyer. So as a dad, I'm seeing this, and what do I start thinking? All the parents in the room, I'm thinking insurance, someone breaks a leg on my property, I'm going to get sued, this is terrible. And so I do one of these with the boys, and say, what question do I ask them? What question do all dads ask them? What were you thinking, right? What is their answer? I don't know. That's exactly what they're. So I would, you realize this could happen, this could happen. And it hit me all of a sudden that when I asked that question, what are they thinking? They didn't know, right? This was not an activity driven by rational thought. It was just not. This was an activity that was some testosterone-fueled thing to impress girls or something that teenage boys do, and all of us as men that were teenage boys probably did very similar things. But it was really an eye-awakening moment for me that a lot of times as leaders, we think in terms of communicating with employees around rational things and sort of on an intellectual basis, where there's a part of their brain that if they're writing the radio flyer, that's not a rational part of the brain. Sociologists that study motivation and psychologists that study motivation say there's really two portions of the human brain. And they call one portion they call the writer, which is symbolized by the monkey there. And the writer is that analytical portion of your mind that is doing these spreadsheet calculations and the ROIs, and this is why we do that and why we don't. And then the elephant is sort of that emotional, passionate side of the brain that is all about sort of feelings and emotion and passion and those kinds of things, right? And so the writer, or the monkey, will sit on top of the elephant, and the writer analytically can kind of guide that elephant for a little while. But over time, that elephant is a pretty big force, right? It's hard to move that and get that elephant to where you want to go. So ultimately, if the elephant wants to go someplace, the elephant will go someplace. So to put that in sort of perspective for me, something you might be familiar with, you might be able to relate to, is that analytical portion of my brain is the side that says, I know Krispy Kreme donuts have like a zillion calories and 200 grams of fat or something just obnoxious, and I really shouldn't eat more than 7 or 8 or maybe 1 or 2 of those. I know I really shouldn't do that. And yet, the taste of that warm Krispy Kreme donut when the frosting is kind of still crispy and they're still warm, I mean, that emotional, you just get going and I just can't stop, right? You just can't stop. How many of you in the audience know that you need to be eating, 5 servings of fruits and vegetables a week? How many of you know that? Everybody knows that. How many of you do that? All right? Some of you do, and good for you. How many of you know that smoking is bad for you and still smoke? Right? There's a lot of those things that rationally we know we should behave this way, but we've got a pretty large elephant up here that's causing us to drive in one way. And I will tell you, most elephants, most answers to why are probably centered more around the elephant than they are around the rider. And so to really connect with that, as leaders, we've got to connect with people's elephants, if you will. We've got to uncover that passion. What is it that really drives these people and help them get to their why? Most people, most leaders, when they approach that and they try and motivate folks, what's the one tool they use? More than any other, most leaders we find try and use money as a motivating tool. Now, money's not bad, but do you really think most people's why is around money? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Most people aren't passionate about money. There are a few. When you go back to the cost of bad bosses and the lessons of bad leadership, and you hear people say, "Yeah, I'd take a pay cut to get a new boss," that's not someone that's motivated by money, right? And so there are other motivational tools at your disposal, and your leadership, I would say, is a prime one, if you can get to that sort of core of why and understand that with people. All right, David, did we have any questions on that? Or are we good?
Yep, so one is a follow-up to the capacity question, and I'm just going to read it because I find it fascinating. It says, please forgive me, I asked the capacity question from a general perspective. Specifically, I'm thinking about employees that have capacity challenges. Their cognitive skill or emotional intelligence don't have the foundation to support growth. As a metaphor, I want to play for the OKC Thunder. I'm 5'9" and weigh 300 pounds. No matter how much weight I lose or how much I practice, I will never play professional basketball. I will reach capacity at some point. I also wonder, is the point of diminishing return on emotional investment. Once they reach capacity, do I still invest in the growth, knowing it's not increasing, or do I use that time to develop someone who has not reached their growth capacity? I apologize for the jumbled thoughts. One thought seems to spur another connected thought. So, let me address the idea of an employee that has hit some sort of limit inside the organization. And we're just going to talk about truth, okay? Now you have to be careful about this because sometimes You think somebody's reached capacity, and maybe they're just, for whatever reason, you haven't put them in the right environment to grow. So your first rule as a leader is, if somebody is not at capacity, you have to say, what have I done or not done to give that person the right opportunity? So before you blame somebody else, you've got to look at yourself first as a leader. That's rule number one. But once you've sort of exhausted opportunities for that person to grow, and you've tried to get them development, all those kind of things, you have to run at that issue. So if actually the name of our company, GiANT, came from the story of David and Goliath, and who was the real hero in that was David, who ran at the problem. The most liberating thing you can do as a leader is run at a problem. So if I've got an employee that for whatever reason, it's literally they've reached their capacity because I'm just like, they'll never make a promotion, right? I mean, they can keep working here, but they'll never get another promotion because they're kind of spent, right? And that happens in organizations. You'll just let somebody sit in a position and they'll kind of take that spot for a long period of time. The minute, if you're a leader, the minute you come to that realization that that employee is kind of done in the organization, you are now stealing from them. Now what I mean from that is the minute that you've done that and you don't tell them, that's the minute you're stealing the rest of their life away from them, where they could leave and go do something that better fits their talent. So once you internalize that you're stealing from it, it actually makes it easier to go have that critical conversation. Like, you know, I love you, but you need to understand you're probably done here in terms of any more promotions. And here's why. And so those critical conversations, Brent and I talk a lot about the difference between doing harm and hurting somebody, right? And Brent tells a great story about you take your kids to the dentist, you know it's going to hurt, right? But you're doing it because you love them and you're trying to help them. So critical conversations, if they're based on, I know this is going to hurt, but I'm trying to help you, that's the most healthy thing. So hope that helps a little bit on that one. And then the second question was, if you're amongst the leadership team for your organization and you can easily see leaders who are below the line or unbalanced in terms of people versus results, how do you motivate them to change, listen, and open mind? So here in a little bit, I'm going to talk about building trust. So there's a combination of building trust and combined with running at the problem. And I'll talk about that one here in a little bit. So those are I took your questions, Brent. Sorry.
There you go. You did good.
All right. Now, saying no. Most people don't like the idea of having to say no to things, right? It creates stress, all of that. But when Brent and I work with different organizations, saying no is actually probably the number one thing we have to teach organizations how to do. We can actually grow an organization, make it far more successful by building the concept of how to say no. So what do I mean by that? This is the way a lot of organizations look. And when I'm talking about this, I'm talking about when people are suggesting ideas or coming up with new products, new markets, new whatever. This is what the decisions look like. Organizationally, they pretty well know what to say yes to. That's the center ring. The outer ring is no, and they know somewhat what to say no to. But there's a whole bunch of stuff that it's kind of an interesting idea. We just hadn't thought about that, so we're in the maybe zone. Maybe zone looks like a lot of meetings, okay? And you can meet for months on somebody's suggestion, and all you're doing is trying to meet to get it to move to either no or yes. So that's a lot of wallowing, okay? I think I've got a picture of wallowing there, all right? And people, you've been in those, right? Where you just, my gosh, are we going to have one more meeting on that same topic? That's sort of what that's talking about. Now, so that's bad. This is another one that's bad, and that is we just say yes to everything. And then we stay in that yes zone until usually about 9 months later, if you've made some decision, you'll hear somebody start going, why are we doing that? That makes no sense. That's not what our organization's about. Why are we doing that? That's because you didn't have the ability or the knowledge of how to say no effectively, so you just try everything. And you really only have maybe one filter like, could we make money at that? I think so. Well, let's go try it, all right? And then next thing you know, you're trying to do everything under the sun. So that's sort of shiny object syndrome or hoarding. Hoarding is a terrible attribute of a lot of organizations. Hoarding looks like we're holding on to old processes too long, old procedures, employees, we've held on to them too long, we're holding on to products or services that we're offering, and we just never get rid of them. So part of saying no is actually, here's a great one, is just do a stop doing meeting every once in a while. Walk into a meeting with a group of the right folks and say, in the next 2 hours, we're going to come up with 5 things we're going to stop doing. It could be a procedure, it could be a piece of paper trail that's going through the organization. It's really effective and extraordinarily liberating. All right, here's what we're trying to get to, that we understand really, really clearly what this organization is about. Now, don't be misled by the size of the graphic here, that small yes. Trust me, Apple has a very clear yes for what they do, right? So you can be a very large organization, but you just have great clarity around what we say yes to. More importantly, we have great clarity around what to say no to. Now, the beauty of having clarity around that, if we've well-defined the yes, and by the way, well-defined the no's, now when we have a meeting and somebody suggests something, it's no longer my idea against your idea, right? I mean, you can actually create filters around these yeses. And so if somebody has just basically a stupid idea, right, I don't have to create stress and say, well, that's a stupid idea. I just say, well, does that fit through our filters? And a lot of times the other person go, yeah, never mind, dumb idea. And it's a great way to reduce stress. So get clarity, and the easy way to do that is just build filters. Now, they have to be tight filters around so you understand where you're aiming yourself. And actually what that does is it creates velocity. A lot fewer meetings, and they're a lot less stressful. So, when we talk about that, when we talk about the power of focus, so if I were to ask you, and there's been studies done, if I just ask a general group, name everything you can name that's white, you would run out of gas in coming up with ideas at about 15 things, okay? Studies show that you'll come up with about 15 things, and you had the whole universe to pick from, and you'll kind of just like, yeah, I can't think of anything else right now, all right? I could turn around and ask you that same question, name everything that's white in a refrigerator, and you would name about 15 things. So question 1, I gave you the entire universe, and you could came up with 15. Question 2, I only asked what's white inside a refrigerator, about the same number. The importance of that is that's channeling of energy, right? So the more clearly we can have what the yes zone is, so everybody knows where we're aiming ourselves, that's where that creative energy is going to go to. Versus when you're sort of in this world, everybody's just thinking up lots and lots of random ideas about what we should be doing inside the organization to try to grow. It's highly stressful. You think it's energetic, but it's not, when every idea has to be considered and looked at and those kind of things. So, tips for leaders. All right. When we talk about trying to hone down to that yes zone just a little bit, you've got to build a framework for that. So I'm going to walk you through just a little bit how to think about that just a little bit. So there's a book out called Blue Ocean Strategy, and it simply is talking about in any organization. By the way, we've even worked with churches, we've worked with nonprofits, we've worked with all kinds of things. And this construct works the same. It doesn't matter if you're in business or nonprofit or church or whatever. And the idea is that in organizations, in markets, there are red oceans and blue oceans. Red oceans are red because there's a lot of fish in that sea. They're all eating each other, and the water is bloody and churning. Blue ocean is blue because you're the only fish in that sea, and the swimming's pretty darn good. So if I were to ask you, well, let me just see a show of hands. How many of you are PC users here? See a show of hands. A little over half. How many of you are Mac users? Okay. Now, everybody knew how to answer that question, right? But I didn't say how many are Hewlett-Packard or how many are Dell or anything like that. You knew that equation. You're either PC, which is a whole bunch of folks, we'll call that the red ocean, or Mac. And I only named one company, and you didn't look at me weird like, why do you ask it that way? That made perfect sense to you the way I asked that question. There's a highly, highly competitive market, yet there's one organization that has figured out how to be unique in their blue ocean. If I asked you about Delta Airlines, American Airlines, United Airlines, and I told you that's the red ocean, who's the blue ocean? Southwest, okay? So you get the idea. By the way, every organization has a blue ocean. I've been doing this for 10 years. We've never found an organization. Now we have to unpack it sometimes because they've long since forgot what truly made them unique. And what happens when that happens, if you're in a blue ocean, all companies start in a blue ocean, all organizations. Somebody came up with an idea, a new technology, a new market, a new service, something. Everybody starts there. But over time, one of two things happen. Either A, the people in the red ocean going, huh, they're doing something kind of cool over there. Let's us go do that too. Let's us go do that too. Remember Circuit City? All right, where are they now? They're out of business. Why? Because they created a really blue ocean. They were the first ones to kind of create that big box around electronics. And who started coming in saying, well, we could do that and we could probably do a little better. Who did that? Best Buy, all right? Circuit City sat still in their blue ocean, and eventually that red ocean basically came over and ran over the top of them and put them out of business, all right? One way to unpack what your blue ocean is, oh, sorry, I had those up there. One way to unpack that is if you cease to exist, what could the market no longer get? What could the market no longer get? So I've done this with cities, right? If Oklahoma City went away, what would Oklahoma Cityans not be able to get anymore, right? Well, I bet you'd start hearing things like quality of life, housing. I mean, they would start naming a lot of things, and some things would be very unique to Oklahoma City. But in your organization, if you cease to exist, what could they not? This group here is from Career Tech, right? So when I was chatting with them this morning, that thought actually went through my head. If Career Tech went away, what could the people that Career Tech serves no longer get? That's pretty blue ocean in my mind, because we're very unique in Oklahoma for having a system like that. So that's a good way to start down the path of what is it that truly makes you unique. By the way, I know there's a lot of people in here that may be associated with quality. It can't be just, it's our people and our quality, okay? Now, it could be quality, but you need to get way more specific than that. Because if I put people and quality on a walnut plaque, trust me, I could carry that from one organization to the next, and everybody in the organization would nod and go, that's us, right? So there's no distinguishing factors around that. You've got to get really specific about what makes you unique. Now, remember I talked about every organization starts in a blue ocean, okay? But as time moves along, what happens is you tend to forget what makes you truly unique. Now we're just doing business. We're just running the organization. And so you've got to create a way to pass on knowledge to others inside the organization. So if the only people that really get what makes you unique are the people at the top or a few people that have just been around forever, that's not enough. Onboarding of new employees, even passing on the knowledge to customers or constituents, whoever, you've got to figure out a way to pass that on. So tribal stories is a great way to do that. And that term just simply comes from, Indian tribes, right? How to figure out a way, how do they pass on their culture from one generation to the next? And it was through tribal stories. Now, what a tribal story does not sound like is I've got a poster on the wall that talks about here's what makes us unique, and I say, here, let's all read this together. That is not a tribal story. So a tribal story, let's pick quality, since this is a quality conference, and say, okay, one of our greatest things is our unique ability to maintain high tolerances in the area of quality. Okay, let's say that's what made you really, really unique, right? So now a tribal story says, okay, let's talk about in the last week where we saw somebody either help us get better at that or how we leverage that. Oh, well, I saw Susie last week. She figured out a whole new way to make that a lot easier for us to watch those tolerance levels. And so, that really helped make life a lot easier for holding those tight tolerances. Okay, now that did two things. One, it's got a little bit of emotional because it's involving Susie, and the other thing that does, it actually triggers part of your brain called the reticular activating system. Most people call it my radar are up, and it sticks. So if you buy a red Mustang, right, and you pull it off the lot, I guarantee before you get home, you'll see 6 more red Mustangs, right? Because you're like, did everybody buy a red Mustang the same day I did? That's sort of what that feels like. Well, that's that piece of your brain that clicks on that. So when you tell a tribal story, what you're doing is actually creating the radar to go up in people's minds. So now all of a sudden I've heard the story about Susie, and I go, oh, that's what we mean by quality. I get that. You can actually motivate people with tribal stories. We do it all the time in our organization. We'll have a Monday morning meeting. We'll pick one of our unique attributes of our deal, and we'll pick somebody and we'll say, let's talk about Malia today, and let's see, somebody tell me a story about where they saw Malia exemplifying some of our unique traits here. They go, oh, well, you know, I saw her last week when that client came in, did yada, 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 right? Well, how do you think Malia feels after that? She feels really, really connected to the organization. She's really motivated. The most motivating thing you can do for an employee is connect them to what the organization is truly about. All right? And that is a great way to do it. I don't care. I've done it with janitors, okay? You can do that with janitors to make everybody in the organization feel connected to the real uniqueness of the organization. Okay, trigger number 3, Mr. Brent.
All right, we did have a couple questions and a comment, David. So one comment that flows really well from your no conversation is this idea that showing no, and the comment is, showing no is actually a form of commitment. And that's very true. How many of you have ever gone into a restaurant that you look at the menu and you can get any kind of food you want, right? There's some of those that are out there. It's almost like they never met a recipe they didn't like. So whether it's barbecue or Italian and Chinese, all that kind of stuff. Now, what's your impression? And if you own one of those, I apologize. But what's your impression of that restaurant? Your impression of that is, you know, I'm not sure that food is really going to be sort of top notch if they don't really specialize in anything, right? And so there's great value in that idea of commitment. We've got a lot of organizations, and you see this a lot in startup mode, and I can understand that. Used to have a boy that lived down the street that whenever we would have a neighborhood garage sale, he'd bring all his toys out and sell his toys every year at the neighborhood garage sale. And his motto was, if someone came up to him and asked him how much the Pokemon card cost, his motto was, any money but no money. All right? Any money but no money. I don't care what it is, any money but no money. And there's a lot of organizations that can sort of get in that mode, is we'll just do anything. But the problem is that really leads you down a path and brands you not as a specialist or an expert in something, but just as someone that says yes all the time. So I thought that was a great follow-on comment. So first question, back from an earlier topic, and that is, how does an employee deal with a dominant style manager? We've actually got a phone number for Guido and Vinny that you can call. Just don't tell them we recommended you. No, that's a hard situation, and I've been in that situation before. And I can tell you, you kind of got two choices, right? The first choice is, I'm a firm believer in that even if a leader is dominant, they're there for some reason, right? And I always like to think, I can probably learn something from just about anybody else. So one comment I would make is, look at that person. They may be a dominant leader. They've probably got skills, strengths, and other areas that if you're honest with yourself, you could probably learn from them, okay? So you always want to try and look for the opportunity in those bad kinds of situations. But the reality is, a lot of times, it's no fun to work for a dominant style manager. It's just not. And so as a choice, you've kind of got to make the choice of, well, I can just sort of live with that and be miserable, or you can do what David talked about and what I'm going to talk about here in a little bit, and that is this idea of going right at the problem and maybe having a discussion with that manager and say, you know, when you do this to me, it really doesn't make me want to sort of go above and beyond. It really sends me off this way. Now you've got to make sure you've got the setup and that there's a level of trust there to do that. I will tell you that there's hope there. Most of the dominant style leaders that we deal with, honestly, there's very few of them that I think that have bad hearts. A lot of those people, when you sort of confront them with that behavior, the response we get is, "Oh wow, I had no idea I was doing that." For whatever reason, it's just that was the way they were sort of brought up in the organization, or how they were treated early on, or whatever. A lot of them just don't know any different style. And so when you sort of put it out there and confront them with that, although that's a difficult conversation, I'll grant you, because it's your boss, but when you do confront them with that, my guess would be a lot of the time, if you have a certain level of trust with them, they'll look at you and say, I had no idea, I don't want to be that person, I'm sorry, I'll try and do better. So I wouldn't hesitate, if you have a level of trust, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit, to go right at that problem. And then the last question is, can you provide some examples of filter criteria. So that idea of the restaurant is a great example. So say you're a guy that you know how to make the best barbecue in the world and you want to start a restaurant, right? One key filter area is around that idea of blue ocean and what is it that really makes you unique, and a filter of am I really leveraging that? Is this decision going to leverage it? So if someone asks you, why don't you offer Italian food on the menu? Then the question should be, well, is that really going to be leveraging my gifts as a barbecue chef? And if the answer is no, then that's something we really don't need to do. We actually have about 5 different filters that we use when we work with organizations on developing strategy, and that's everything from, let's get real clear on what products we're going to provide and what value we're providing to an end customer. What markets are we going to play in? What are our gifts as an organization? And we want to make sure and stay inside those. We don't want to be sort of that one-size-fits-all. We want to be focused really on our strength zone as we move forward. And so those are just some examples of filters, but there's lots of different ones as well. Okay, so the third trigger point, and that is you serve them, not the other way around. So I get the chance about 2 or 3 times a year to put on the tuxedo and go to functions or events. And I've got to confess that every time I put on a tuxedo, there's a part of me that stands in front of the mirror and does sort of that James Bond kind of, this sort of deal. And you say Bond, James Bond, only it's Douglas, Brent Douglas. And so my guess would be a lot of the men in the audience do the same thing. And if you say no, then I think you're liars, because that's just a very cool thing to be like James Bond and say that. Most leaders, or a lot of leaders, when they get promoted to, say, a C-level position or move up in the organization, they kind of have that feeling of, I've got the tuxedo, I'm sort of James Bond walking down the hall, that I'm all that. And that can be very dangerous. Our suggestion would be, that's not a terrible picture, but we need to add something to that picture to really get you into the idea of what you should be doing as a leader, and that is serving the organization. So think of taking that tuxedo and putting the towel on that arm like a good maitre d'. Now, a lot of times when you talk with leaders about your job is really to serve, that almost sounds a little bit sort of wimpy or milquetoast-ish, right? And that's not what I mean. Serving is not it's not for the faint of heart, and it's not for those without courage. Serving can be very difficult. So as a tip, when we talk about leaders, and we actually get this question a lot in our coaching session, people will explain a certain situation to us and sort of present us with an employee problem or whatever. And the question is always, now what is my role as the leader in this? What should I be doing? And so we've developed this framework that we use that you serve, and this is sort of how you serve as a leader. And that is, number 1, providing focus for the organization. Number 2, energizing people. And the third one is growing those around you. Focusing, energizing, and growing others. I'll talk a little bit about those in turn. So focus, we've already talked a little bit about that, and that is simply providing clarity around why, how, and what. So clarity around why. Here's why we exist as an organization. Our mission is to do this. And as we talked earlier, that's probably not, our mission is to create value for the shareholders, right? That's not really going to motivate anybody. But to provide that clarity around, as an organization, here's what we're all about. Here's why we exist. And here's how we're going to go about serving at the restaurant, dealing with students at the VOTEC, whatever your job, here's how we're going to go do that. Here's the standards we're going to hold ourselves to as an organization and how we go about our daily work. And then here's what we're going to really focus on. Here's the product we're going to produce, or here's the value we're going to provide. It's amazing to me how many organizations that we go into that you'll get the leadership team together and just start asking people to write down answers to these questions. And if there's 10 people in the room, a lot of times we'll get 10 different answers. And so as a leader, one of the primary functions of a leader, especially a top leader, is to provide clarity and get everybody on the same page of those 3 things. Let's make sure we're focused on the right things and that everybody's sort of behind the large boulder pushing in the same direction, okay? And that's largely around understanding what's the strategy for the organization, what's the mission, what's our vision for the future, where we go on those kinds of things. The second thing is energizing. One of the key functions of any leader is managing the emotions of yourself and your team. Now let me explain that for a minute, because when I say manage emotions, my dad, whenever I would come home from school and I would say, gosh, Jim made me so mad today, my dad would always stop me. He would say, oh, nope, no he didn't. And it would always kind of tick me off because I knew he was right. He goes, Jim's not in control of your emotions. You're in control of your emotions. No one can make you mad or sad. Only you can sort of control that. So you can filter any situation. Those people can't control how you feel. So when I say managing emotions, what I don't mean is that you sort of do mind control and make people happy or make people sad or do that, because you can't do that as a leader. But I do think you can manage the emotions of yourself and your team. And you certainly can do that for yourself, right? 3 elements of that, and the first one I would say is calm. One common leadership misconception, and you've heard it before, this idea of, man, we never want to waste a good what? Crisis. Because what happens in a crisis? In a crisis, people get real focused. Now, this is not necessarily a universal rule, because I will say, if I go into the emergency room with chest pain, I don't necessarily care how the doctors are treating the nurses. I want total focus on sort of the results of taking care of me, right? I want them in that crisis mentality. Most organizations, though, I've worked with leaders before that's the only way they knew how to get things done. So it was just, let's spin up one crisis, and let's always keep the organization sort of in this mode of, we're not sure if we're gonna be there tomorrow or not, and it's incredibly, incredibly stressful. So one thing you can do as a leader is to make sure you're injecting calm into the organization. Recent studies out of Princeton University around the effects of stress on IQ are absolutely amazing. Studies just from about a year ago indicated that people under high degrees of stress can lose up to 25 to 40% of their IQ. 25 to 40% of their IQ. If I lost 40% of my IQ, I'd be in a Red Ryder wagon, riding down my driveway. It would not be a pretty thing. That's the impact of stress on an organization. Is you actually can make the people around you dumber, and we don't want to do that. As leaders, we want to help make them smarter. Not to say you're not going to have stress in your life, but the way you approach that stress and the way you sort of view that, we always tell people, in any kind of problem, there's an opportunity in there somewhere to do better. In fact, most studies on customer loyalty show customer loyalty is not highest when there's never an issue. Customer loyalty is when, man, they got my order wrong, but they took care of that in a way that really exceeded my expectations. So that screw up that order, yeah, maybe it's stressful, but that's an opportunity for you to really show what you're good at as an organization, right? So maintaining calm. Consistent. I've had leaders before that one day they're just happy and all smiles, the next day they're yelling and screaming. And so what happens with those leaders is you're never sure sort of what you're going to get. They're not predictable, and so it's hard to give someone feedback or work with someone if you don't know whether you're going to be yelled at or praised from one day to the next. So leaders need to be consistent. And then lastly, confident. This whole idea of let's view problems as opportunities, right? It's real easy, it's very easy to get into that mode of the sky is falling, we might as well just pack it up and go home. And if you get to that point as a leader, you're done in terms of respect and being able to drive any meaningful activity. And the last one is grow. So David's going to talk a little bit more about trust here in a second, and we've had some questions sort of around this. Because grow is one of those things that is, it sounds easy, but it's hard to do. So Dr. Henry Cloud is a psychologist that now does executive coaching, coaches a lot of top-name CEOs. And he talks about, when we talk about employees, most employees fall into one of 2 categories. The first category is the wise employee. A wise employee, if they're doing something that as a boss, you go to them and say, Jim, I don't know that you realize you're doing this, but when you do this, you have this effect on the team. The wise person is the one that would respond to that and say, I had no idea I was having that effect. Thank you for giving me that feedback. I don't want to be that guy. Can you give me some tips on how I might improve that, okay? The foolish person, which is the second type, the foolish person is the one that says, that's not me, that's this guy over here, or that's every kind of feedback you ever give them, it's always deflected, well, that's the organization's fault, that's because I don't have enough people, it's because I don't have time. There's always some excuse that feedback you give to them always sort of bounces back off of you. It's just like throwing a rubber ball against a wall, it doesn't stick. And so your strategy when it comes to helping others grow depends on which of those you get. So if you're dealing with a foolish person and you've provided them feedback on an issue for a couple of times and it's just sort of bouncing off and not sticking, then it's time for a reset. And that reset conversation goes something like, we're going to have a different conversation this time because I've given you feedback on this behavior and it's always somebody else's problem, and we need to talk about why you can't sort of deal with that fact that you've got a stake here. And so we need to have a reset. And if we can't get this solved, then maybe it's time for us and you and the organization to part ways. Now, that's a very difficult conversation to have, but you got to have sort of that reset when you do that. Wise people are easy. Wise people, they love that feedback. If you've got a trusting relationship with them, giving feedback to a wise person, it's like watering a plant. They're gonna want all they can get, and they just love it, and will grow as a result of that. Now, that's not easy, and like David said, it's kind of like you have to put yourself in the mindset of if you're a parent and you've ever had to take your kid to the dentist. Taking your kid to the dentist and going to the dentist, it doesn't look like that. If there are any dentists in the audience, I'm sorry, but it doesn't look like that. When I'm sitting in that chair, I'm not smiling and singing happy songs and thinking happy thoughts, right? It really looks a lot more like this, that you got needles coming at you and drill sounds and those kinds of things. It's not fun. And yet, as a parent, I've had to take my boys to the dentist, and they did not want to go. In fact, they told me, "Dad, I don't want to go. Please don't make me go." Right? And I knew that going to the dentist was going to hurtful. There was going to be some pain involved. If they had to have a tooth pulled or something drilled or something like that. And yet, as a parent, you would look at me and say, "You're a terrible parent if you don't take your kid to the dentist," right? Leadership is no different. Sometimes you may have an employee or a coworker that you have to take to the dentist. And like David talked about earlier, that's going to hurt them. And I will tell you, as a leader, that is okay. Get the notion out of your head that as a leader, you're not allowed to hurt people. And there's a difference between hurting them and harming them, okay? We never want to harm somebody, but sometimes as a leader, you've got to hurt them to give them the feedback that they need to have, just like you would when you're taking your kid to the dentist. Okay, David's gonna, or do we have any questions?
We do.
Okay.
One had to do with the filtering idea and the idea that that would take creativity out of the organization. And I will tell you, there was a point in my life I feared that very same thing. And it happened back in my days at Ditch Witch. And we loved new ideas. In fact, we wouldn't hire engineers. We were trying to hire inventors because we wanted lots and lots of creativity. But we were not growing like we wanted to grow. And so we spent a lot of time wallowing in ideas and saying yes to way too many things. And so that was actually my first epiphany around this idea of filtering. And the way we filtered it was, instead of saying we make trenchers, right? One of our filters, well, what do we do? What do we make, right? And we had to pick the product. How do we describe the product? Was it going to be trenchers, which is pretty narrow? Was it going to be construction equipment, pretty wide? And what we landed on is we're a product company that puts pipe and cable underground. Okay? Now that's way narrower than construction equipment, but it's broader than just trenching equipment, right? It talked about what the product does, not what the product is. Now when we did that, we had 100 and some engineers up in engineering, and I thought, oh man, I was literally internally thinking, I hope there isn't a mass exodus because we've tightened this up to where they can't be as creative. Within a week, the head of engineering comes and goes, thank you, because now we know where to aim our energy. We know where to aim our creativity, and we went from about 120 million to 350 million in about 5 years because we were getting all of the energy focused. So don't fear filtering. It's really, really healthy for an organization. I'm not going to be able to get through all of these. There was one that says to connect employees to the organization, train them to pull the organization. It's just, I'll go back to when I was 23 years old. I was out on a construction site, brand new at Ditch Witch, and my goal was to be the best employee of all mankind, right? I mean, that was my goal. So I'm standing there, and this guy's working on a piece of equipment, and I'm right by his side, and I'm like, man, if he tells me to do anything, I'm going to go do it. And he'd go, yeah, go get that wrench. Man, I run to get the wrench. I bring him back. Yeah, go get that chain over there. I run over and I get that chain. We went through that exercise about 4 or 5 times. He looked at me and goes, you know, you'd be a lot more help to me if you could look ahead of what I'm trying to do and be ready for me, right? Meaning sort of be out in front and pull me in the right direction. Don't wait for me to have to And that's an agonizing thing to be a leader, to try and have to tell everybody what to do. So whoever made that comment's exactly right, is teaching people how to pull the organization and not wait to be told is really powerful. Okay, last thought, and we're going to take a break, and then we're going to come back with some great folks that have done a lot of cool things as leaders. We've talked several times about this idea of having critical conversations, whether it's with a boss, it could be with somebody outside your organization, could be with an employee, could be with a fellow employee that's on the same level. And you have to understand that in life, there's this part of us that is in sort of transaction mode, but occasionally we have moments where we actually build strong relationships. Now, if I'm going to have a critical conversation with you, I've got to make sure we have a trusting relationship. Because if you don't trust me, it'll just bounce off of you, whatever I have to say. But if you trust me, you'll sort of catch that. We call that getting caught on the other side of that. So when Brent and I go talk to a leader in some capacity, and I know we're going to have a very critical conversation where we kind of look at them going, what are you doing? You know, one of those. We will never do that until we are sure that we have trust. And to this day, we've never had a leader who trusted us that didn't catch us on the other side of that, when we sort of jumped over the wall with something pretty harsh in terms of some truth, but we had trust. So what do you physically, or sort of, what is the actual way you create trust? And there has to be two elements to create trust in a relationship, and those are competence and character. So competence is, you know what you're talking about, right? You have just the knowledge base to be able to do that. Character is your value system, right? So you can't be, from a character standpoint, one of those that talks out of both sides of your mouth. You've got to be true to who you are, and it's got to be pretty high value system. When you have sort of that high values, good character, and good character can also just be, I just like that guy. I'd go have a beer with that guy, all right? So it's just, you're just likable almost. And then the competence. When you get those two together, that's what's trust. When you have that, now you're ready to go speak. So if you've got Brent talked about a boss that's really difficult. Trust me, if he trusts you, you have a much higher likelihood of them catching you on the other side. Believe me, you can have bad consequences in that too, right? Let's not kid around. You can have, if he's really bad and they don't catch you on the other side, actually, it may not be that bad. You may have just made a really good life decision so that you know where you belong in life.
How about a round for Brent and David?